So welcome back to the next faction showcase for Third Age Reforged, and now we will be shifting our perspective back to the good kingdoms of men and to Dale. And as with most of the other kingdoms of men that fight on the good side of Middle-earth in particular, the kingdoms of men do have a pretty unique sense of versatility about them. There isn't really a situation in which they will find themselves completely out of their comfort zone for the most part, and Dale certainly play into this strength. In fact, it might be the thing they rely on more than anything else, as they don't really have the linchpins that some of the other kingdoms of men have that they can rely on a little bit more. So army selection is going to be quite critical as Dale. And to tie this back to Mordor, which we did last time, there is a sense of disparity between their lower tier front line and some of their better units that they will be spreading throughout their lines, which, you know, that disparity can be the sort of thing which wins you or loses you the battle, because it can work against you as well as for you in terms of saving a bit of money on your front line. However, we shall start off with their siege equipment, starting off with the catapult. And of course, you know, this is just a basic catapult. There's nothing too special to talk about here. You know, obviously it's going to be mostly useful in a siege. You can use it in an open field to try and get people to come towards you, which as Dale you might want to do more often than you want to be offensive per se. But to be honest with you, there are probably better ways to do this than a catapult in the open field. Most experienced players will simply spread out their lines and try and absorb the catapult fire, and then you've essentially spent 1,000 on doing not an awful lot. However, moving on to the ballista, and while this is for the time being, a regular ballista, at some point in the future I understand there is plans to introduce some more unique siege equipment along the same lines as the Isengard ballista and the Troll catapult, and this is one of the things which would change. I understand that Dale, the plan would be to give them a full-sized wind lance instead of a ballista, which naturally would mean Dale would have a pretty big strength in terms of their siege equipment in this way. I would imagine it would be highly accurate and highly damaging, sort of along the same lines, ironically, as the Isengard ballista in terms of its ability to penetrate units as well. But for the time being, it is just the standard ballista. But moving on to the infantry now, which is where things start to get a little bit more interesting, other than the, aside from the siege. We will start off with the civilians, and this is of course a unit they share with a couple of the kingdoms of men, including Gondor, as we have already seen, and there is no real difference between them. Obviously, they are not a particularly fantastic tour de force in melee. They do have 4 attack, which is actually better than some of the other militia units, but they do pay for this dearly in terms of their defense. An armor of 0, shield value of 0, they'll melt to archers. Really most things will be able to defeat the civilians. It's really more of a novelty unit than anything else. But they are very cheap, so if you do have 150 florins left over with just 1 free unit spot, you might want to get some civilians just to pad your line a little bit. But where things tend to get a little bit more interesting, if the lag would leave me, is in their front line. And this is some of the lower tier of Dalian units. So the first line we have the Greenwood Lumbermen, which you could sort of say are, well, they're not really a militia unit. I mean, they do cost around the same as the Dwarven Miners, which are a militia unit for Khazad-dûm, but obviously tiers work slightly differently between the factions, and here we have the Dalian lower tier shock troops at least, and they are of course two-handed axemen, which do mean they are effective against armour. Interestingly enough as well, they have a defensive skill of 3, which is actually better than the Rudar axemen, I believe, but they do pay for this in other ways. They have a lower attack value for 1. Charge bonus of 8 is pretty good. However, their total defense is where most lower tier axe units like this suffer quite dearly, and obviously this is because of their low armour and relatively low skill values and their complete lack of a shield. But for 400 you could stand to do a lot worse. I mean, it's a very similar story with the Greenwood Lumbermen as it is with something like the Orc Maulers from Mordor, where if you blanket the field with them, you've got quite a lot of cheap armour piercing, which can do pretty decently against units which are more expensive than them in many cases. But of course the same situation applies here, where they will be horribly weak to enemy arrow fire because of their, you know, very low armour and no shield values. Then we move on to the 3 Laketown units, which is where the majority of Dale's front lines will often be made up of units like this. Now the Laketown infantry are of course the swordsman unit here, the sword and board unit, and you can see that their stats are not great. I mean, they have an attack of 4, their total defense is 13, their armour in particular is somewhat lacking compared to other kingdoms of men and the kind of infantry they will be fielding, and this is really the trade-off that is part of Dale's identity in many ways. If you look at the Gondor infantry, which is kind of an equivalent unit, the Gondor infantry is of course better in every way, but it's also more expensive by I think they're a little bit, just a little bit over 100 florins more expensive than the Laketown infantry. But this is because the Laketown infantry essentially combine sort of the standard mid-tier infantry that you'd be building your lines with more militia-like qualities. and this of course means that you'll be spending a lot less on units like this, so you'll have more money to spend elsewhere. Now this of course has pros and cons, because it means for a start these units are going to be a lot less robust than especially the other kingdoms of men that have similar playstyles to Dale. So Gondor, for example, their Gondor infantry is going to be far better. However, the Laketown infantry is cheaper, so it's pros and cons, which, you know, I'm sure that when J Monster gets around to talking about Dale, he'll go into in a little bit more detail about the army composition videos. But just know for here that you do save a bit of money, but of course the price for that is, you know, less quality. And this is essentially a trend which follows throughout all of their line, really, at the front here, including the Greenwood Lumbermen to a lesser extent. But the Laketown Spears, again, obviously they can form shield wall, but they have lower stats than the equivalent units from other kingdoms of men. Even Cardlin have got sort of units which tend to be of higher quality than the Laketown units. But they do have a bonus fighting cavalry that can make shield wall, very good to send out to the flanks to protect your flanks from enemy cavalry, and of course they can form shield wall in a siege to really block up choke points. But it is worth saying as well that they are a little bit more disposable, so enemy archers probably, even in spite of their lower armor values, probably won't want to go for the Laketown units, because their shield value is relatively decent, a nice large round shield here providing a shield value of 6, and only 400, so that is a very good value proposition for a unit like this. And Dale players will often be fielding quite a few Laketown units depending on the situation. And then we come to the it's interesting to think about the Laketown pikemen in many ways, because they are again one of those quintessential lower tier pikemen which have obviously relatively low stats, low armor as well, so they're going to be horribly weak to arrows, but they do the job that lower tier pikemen do very well, which means they can be very cost effective. Again, units that you can look to be similar to the Laketown pikemen would be the Corsair pikemen from Umbar or the Greenwatch Garrison footmen from Cardillan. They will do a very good job at stopping much more expensive units than themselves in their tracks for long periods of time, as a result being pikes, and of course they can counteract enemy halberdiers quite well as well, but of course they're going to do horribly against enemy arrow fire, and as soon as they get surrounded, the generally lower morale of units like this means they will probably break off pretty quickly. But they can be a very useful, cheap tool to keep enemy infantry rushes at bay, so potentially a pretty good pick against the likes of Angmar or the Misty Mountains, depending on what sort of composition they have brought. Having said that, as we move backwards, Dale do have a unit which is more comparable to the Gondorian units of a similar type, and that is the Dalian Spearmen. 650, so they are very similar in many ways to the Gondor Spearmen, only, you know, they have, I think, a slightly higher attack than the Gondorian Spears, but the total defense, I think, again is slightly lower, but they do have pretty good skill, honestly, and this is what really sets them apart from some of the other kingdoms of men's basic spears who are very reliant on their armor values. The Dalian Spearmen, a little bit less so, a little bit higher in terms of the skill. 650 though, so if you did want to spend a little bit more on some spears for your line, this is going to offer you a much more comparable level of quality to other kingdoms of men as opposed to the Laketown units, but do note that you are going to be spending around the same amount of money for that quality as opposed to saving any money. And over here you can apparently upgrade the armor, which does give a slight difference. You can see there's a little bit more plate here, so the Dalian Spearmen will then become a very unattractive proposition to try and skirmish down from a distance, with again with a shield value of 6, but they will have higher armor values as a result of this. Now, so far we've only talked about how Dale can save money to relatively bring some better units, and this is where we start to see where some of Dale's more expensive options come into play. Starting off with the Barding Herd, they are of course a halberdier unit which use those sort of long bardiche axes, and obviously they can form phalanx, are effective against armor, bonus fighting cavalry like most halberdiers do. But having a look at some of their stats, they have a huge armor value of 10, and this is where Dale's higher tier units start to gain pretty significantly in terms of their armor value, so a bit of the dwarven influence there coming into play for their nearest allies. And defensive skill of 3 is obviously relatively low, but polearm units don't need a lot of defensive skill most of the time, and they also have a slight shield value of 4 as a result of carrying that round shield on their back. But really, they are a very, very difficult front line to break down, especially if you're a faction which is pretty reliant on your armor, because trying to go through the front of the Barding Herd is really going to end in tears, but they do cost 750. So again, you can't really spend an awful lot of money on units like this because of Dale. Basically they have a choice to make. When they sort of have their Laketown units and their lower tier units holding down the front, they then have to decide what more expensive units to bring, and this is obviously true for all of Total War in general, but this is brought into sharp relief with Dale because you cannot afford to bring all of their units that are on this tier, but the Barding Herd are probably the ones you're going to see quite a lot against factions with higher armour. You probably won't see them against the Elves other than in Ladris all that much, but other than that you can expect to see them because they're pretty difficult to skirmish down from a distance as well, honestly. Dale also have a Swordmaster unit, however, and once again they are slightly more expensive. They are of course 800, the Swordmasters of Karnan. This is actually one of Dale's higher tier units which doesn't have a great armour value, but they do have a very high defensive skill of 15, a nice attack of 15 as well. So if you're up against a faction which is potentially of lower armour values, or you suspect you're going to be getting into a prolonged melee in which preserving your own lives through your defensive skill is going to be a little bit more significant, then the Swordmasters of Karnan will be a good choice. And of course they have had a price reduction in the latest update of the game, and with those Zweihanders they will do a very good job. Now again, comparably speaking, all of the human Swordmaster units such as these guys, the Kaer Andros Swordmasters, the Abrazanim Narduzagar, all the stuff like that are going to be comparable to one another. Which one is best or not I don't know yet because I haven't tested that out, but this is the sort of unit that you can expect them to keep pace with for the most part. And then finally we have another unit which is very Dale indeed. We have the Earls of Esgaroth, which is, oh, again, that's the second time I've done that. We can see here that this is obviously a much more solid frontline troop than the Laketown infantry at the front. Significantly more expensive though at 825, but the total defense value is mainly because of the huge armor value of 12, the nice shield value of 7. Defensive skill of 7 is relatively average for a unit like this, but you know, their strengths lie elsewhere. Attack of 10, so again, a unit that you can bring en masse. I think you can bring 3 before the cost increases, so this puts them kind of in the same boat as the Castamir's Legion and the Guardians of Khan Doom. A more expensive frontline pick to be sure, but if you bring them, especially if you bring them in conjunction with the Barding Herd or the Swordmasters of Karnan, your front line is going to be very, very difficult to break down. There's very few factions that are going to want to go up against the Earls of Esgaroth combined with some of these other units in a straight fight. Dale are very capable at holding their own in a line battle, perhaps more so than some of the Kingdoms of Men, should the conditions be right. But obviously a very, very strong unit, but obviously they do have a bit of a weakness against armour piercing, which of course, if you're facing Dale, bringing a couple of units of armour piercing just to try and counteract a unit like this is often a good idea. Now we come to the first Morroquendi unit that Dale can bring, and that is the Morroquendi pikes. Now, once upon a time they actually had the halberdier animation, which kind of made them worthless, but times have changed since then, and they are now one of the finer higher tier pikes that you can get in the game. I wouldn't say they're as good as stuff like the First Legion or the Imladris Sentries, I think it is, from Imladris. But they are still a very strong unit, so potentially you can have one hell of a phalanx as Dale if you bring nothing but Laketown pikes, Barding Herd and the Morroquendi pikes. If your opponent has not brought anything in terms of archers, they will really live to regret that as the battle goes along. But other than that, obviously expensive pikes. They also frighten nearby enemy infantry. I didn't actually know that, but yes, the fear effect that they cause is obviously going to allow them to stand firm in the face of lower tier units all day long, and even higher tier units are not really going to want to attack them from the front. So again, really circumventing the situation or trying to skirmish them down. The armor value of 7 alone won't really be enough to save them as time goes on. But the final Dalian infantry unit is another unit which has clearly seen some dwarven influence with how heavy they go on armor, and that is the Girians Paladins, of course, one of the few multiple HP shock troops in the game. Obviously with those giant great maces, they inspire nearby troops, they frighten nearby enemy infantry. Of course they're effective against armor with a weapon like that, and total defense is really where they come down hard because of their armor values. They don't have the highest skill in comparison to the two-handed sword generals bodyguards, but you know, the effectiveness against armor kind of cancels those two things out. Obviously no shield, so they can still be skirmished down, particularly when you consider they've only got 63 men in the unit, so you really don't want to be losing effectiveness on them if you can help it. I like the sort of horse mane helms they've got. It's quite Roman in style, and obviously an attack of 21 and a charge bonus of 10 means if they connect well in a charge with a basic infantry line, they're going to hack their way through it, or smash their way through it I should say, in quick order. So that was Dale's sort of mixed bag of an infantry line, but we shall now move on to probably what they're more well known for, which is of course their skirmishers and their cavalry. So I don't think it's unfair to say that archers are really what Dale is known for more than anything else, but let's take a look at their archer line in a little bit more detail to understand a little bit more on why this is, and part of it does come down to that versatility that I mentioned at the start. But actually we start off with a unit that isn't an archer at all. It is in fact a lower tier javelinman, which is the Laketown River Patrol. Now 550 is a relatively low outlay for a unit which can do quite a lot of damage. One of the more significant things about a unit like this, though, is I think that its bonus against cavalry in terms of how much damage it can do with those armor-piercing missiles, 2 marauding heavy lancers that are sort of going around your back lines, trying to get to your very important archers, can be very good. And of course they can hide anywhere, which means they won't be targeted by enemy archers from the off, because of course they will be lying in wait, waiting to spring their trap. Now obviously they're terrible in melee, this sort of unit. I mean, they do actually have a defensive skill of 4, which is actually not dreadful, considering this kind of unit usually has like almost non-existent melee stats. But having said that, the missile attack is obviously what you're paying for here. Now they're not quite as throwaway as something like the Orc Javelins are, because they are 200 florins more expensive, and of course they do play a little bit more of a significant role in Dale's army, often to try and help deal with that cavalry, or potentially to just try and thin out the enemy infantry ranks, which you might find yourself outnumbered, especially if you're up against the Orcs. But yeah, quite a common pick from Dale. Obviously they've had a new reskin since vanilla, where they just had those sort of brown tunics. And another Laketown unit, we of course have the Laketown Bowmen, which are the lowest tier of Dalian Archer, which play quite an important role, I think, in Dale's roster, because of course they have a little bit more in terms of numbers than their peers, and they have a missile attack of 6 as well, which for a unit that costs 600 is really not that bad at all. I mean, a lot of these lower tier archers, the entry level archers for factions, will often have lower missile damage than that, and in fact the Laketown Bowmen can outdamage a huge chunk of the archers from factions such as Gondor and Umbar, and this is only the first archer in their roster, of course. Now they're not terribly good at staying alive under archer fire, because there are, the armor value of 3, no shield at all, but of course there are a lot of them, and generally speaking you often purchase lower tier archers like this with the understanding that yes, a lot of them are going to die under enemy skirmish fire, but they're going to give as good as they can get against other lower tier archers, and they should be able to be quite cost effective against higher tier archers as well. But this is where Dale's archer line gets a little bit more significant and scary, starting off with the standard Dalian Marksmen. Now of course their stats are a little bit better across the board, but they also have a missile attack of 7, which is usually the sort of thing you'll expect to see from some of the more entry level to mid level elven archers, which is always good to see. They do have a shield value as well. It's only a minor one of 3, but it is still present nonetheless. An arm value of 6 is not terrific, but it's not dreadful either, considering some of the units that we'll often be skirmishing with. But obviously this is the first of Dale's arch units which their quality tends to outstrip their peers a little bit, because that generally higher missile attack, they do cost 750, which is not a small amount of money, but oftentimes if you go for a skirmish heavy approach, a unit like this doesn't look out of place, simply because individually they can survive a little bit better, and they can dish out quite a hefty amount of punishment as well, provided they aren't focused down. But Dale can bring so many archers that often a single unit getting focused down isn't really the end of the world. Obviously they too have a similar upgrade model to the spearmen that we saw previously, but if you want to invest just a little bit more in terms of your archers, only 25 more to be fair, you can get the Bardian Marksmen, which if we sort of have a look between them, really the difference is that the armor value here is a little bit greater, and so too is the shield value, but this of course comes at the cost of defensive skill. But then again, a unit like this, generally speaking, you're going to want them to be at home more at range than they are in melee, and the Bardian Marksmen can actually double as pretty decent melee infantry when all is said and done, purely because of their ability to be a bit more of a tar pit than the Dalian Marksmen, even if the Dalian Marksmen are slightly better in melee. But they are two very comparable units. The Bardian Marksmen, however, you pay 25 more for, mainly because they are better in the role that archers are traditionally fulfilling, which is at range, and they too have an upgrade model. And I really love this upgrade model. I like the fact that the lamellar armor gets a little bit thicker. They've got those Dalian helms, and obviously this is a unit which very few other main human archers are going to want to go toe to toe with. A very similar unit to compare the Bardian Marksman with would be the Abrazanim Nadubawi from Umbar, that sort of thing. I wouldn't really compare them to the Cairandros Marksman, because the Cairandros Marksman are a little bit more potent in melee. But it'll be interesting to sort of look at all of these units side to side when I do start sort of running them against one another, rather than just looking at them as their own entities. But yes, Dale's archer line, these two units with their upgrade models are very significant, because they're very difficult to try and skirmish down from afar, and this often leads to people being a little bit more aggressive against Dale, mainly because of the ability of Dale to field skirmisher forces like that. Another significant unit, of course, is that Dale do have a ranger unit. I mean, it wouldn't be an archer-focused faction if it didn't, considering how effective rangers can be. And of course, this is the Athala Rangers, looking like thieves from Dark Souls. And if we have a look at some of their stats, obviously a total defense of 14, defensive skill of 11, A little bit lower than the Númenórean Shadow Guard that we saw before. 850 obviously, sort of standard ranger price. Missile attack of 5 is standard ranger damage. And yeah, I mean, I'm going to say this until I'm blue in the face really. Every time we encounter a ranger I'll say the same thing. They are very, very effective at dealing with hordes of infantry, of course. But it really depends on who you're going up against and what sort of plan you want to employ if you want to bring rangers in an open field. In a defensive siege or an offensive siege, rangers will often make an appearance just because of their ability to swing the tide of a fight when it gets choke pointy. And then, Dale also have an elven archer that is joining their roster in the Morroquendi bows, which of course does somewhat set them apart from the other kingdoms of men, which do focus a little bit more around their archers. Gondor do from a certain point of view, and there is of course Arthedain, who we will get onto at a later date. But the Morroquendi bows offer a bit of elven expertise to the Dale archer line, and this of course means high accuracy, high damage for the kind of unit it is. A missile attack of 8 is very high, and they also are pretty decent in melee. A defensive skill of 10 is not disrespectful, and a melee attack of 12 is not half bad either, but you do pay 1,000 for them. And for Dale to bring their elven units, they do have to pay a little bit more than the elves themselves would have to bring. But even so, under certain circumstances, the Morroquendi bows can do tons of damage because of their accuracy. Really depends on who you're fighting, though, whether you want to bring the Morroquendi bows. Now, we move back into Dale's 2 General's Bodyguard units that can be put into, well, the 2 General's Bodyguard units that are archers. Starting off with the Dalian Royal Guard, which are a little bit more defensive in nature. They have an armour value of 12, a defensive skill of 19, melee attack of 20. Essentially, these are two-hander sword units that, well, in melee, and obviously they are a decent archer unit at range. Missile attack of 7. They're kind of very much along the same lines of the Bardian Marksmen at range, but they are significantly tougher to bring down in melee. Other than that, there's really not a great deal to say. 1,200 is a pretty hefty amount to spend on a General's Bodyguard, but even so, I mean, they can add to Dale's already pretty scary skirmish line. However, most of the time, I think people are going to be very tempted to bring this unit over here, which is of course the Blackshot Dragon Slayers. They cost 100 more, and overall, having a look at some of their stats, I mean, they actually have higher armour but lower defensive skill, and this perhaps comes into I'm not sure if they're effective against armour in melee. You'd think from the size of their swords that they would be, but swordsmen generally are not. But again, maybe this is something that could be clarified. I know that they're armour piercing at range, however. This is one of the 3 units, like the Temple Guard that we saw last time, to have those armour piercing missiles, and I also think they have a missile attack of 10. They are, I think, the most effective of the armour-piercing archers at range, and they pay for this by being slightly less effective in melee, but even so, they're still a multiple HP, very high stat-based unit in melee as well. Obviously, they pull out their wind lances when they're firing from afar. Very, very strong, and also a very safe place to put your general, because generally speaking, any old fodder is not going to be enough to bring down the Blackshot Dragon Slayer, so they're really going to have to go after them, and of course they allow you to snipe out key enemy targets throughout the battlefield, which is what armour-piercing archers like this are really the best in the game at. They can't hide, however, so you're not even taking away the hiding attribute, which of course the general can inflict on a unit, because they can't hide anyway. So yeah, obviously one of the more iconic units from the Dalian roster purely because of that Wind Lance and how effective they can be at range. Now we move on to the Dalian Cavalry, which has actually gotten a little bit smaller since Reforged was first a thing. Starting off, we have the Dalian Cavalry, which of course shares the same model as the Dalian Spearmen. Obviously they have slightly longer lances over here, and they also have the upgrade model, which of course has the same effect on them as it does on the archers and the spearmen. They're the Lancers of Dale, which means they're effective against armour off the charge. They have a shield, which is actually something that some Lancers in the same sort of class don't have. Obviously that armour-piercing charge bonus of 15. You do need to be somewhat careful with them. I mean, they do have decent armour when you upgrade the armour of them, so they can stand up to archers, and they are pretty swift as well. The Dalian Cavalry can't be caught by just any old rubbish. However, obviously as soon as they get caught by melee cavalry and wargs in melee, they will start to drop like flies. They are not multiple HP, they don't have the highest skill of units like this. I think the Pinneth Gelling Cavalry of Gondor has got slightly higher skill than this unit here. But yeah, they're basically your quintessential Lancers. Don't leave them in sustained combat for too long, and they shouldn't steer you too far wrong. 700, you could stand to do a lot worse for 700 florins. And then, playing into some of Dale's more defensive attributes, we of course have the mounted version of the Earls of Esgaroth, the Earls of Dale. They cost 1,000 each, which is no small amount of money, but they are also a melee I think you can have 2 before the cost increases, and they are of course melee cavalry, which means you can use them in a lot more defensive a fashion. You can use them to help ward off enemy cavalry from your sidelines, and if enemies sort of remain static and don't attack into Dale for extended periods of time, that is when Dale are at their best, because it of course means their extensive skirmish line can continue to do their work. And the Earls of Dale are probably one of the more important units in the Dalian roster in this regard, purely because they are capable of dealing with high tier enemy cavalry. Very, very few units are going to want to go into a sustained fight with the Earls of Dale on horseback. Of course there are units, and Dale could struggle in a cavalry sense against factions that have high tier melee and lancer cavalry, something like Dol Amroth for example, which would be an interesting matchup to see how Dale could contest that cavalry game. But nonetheless, the Earls of Dale for the most part won't steer you far wrong in terms of a cavalry engagement. Very, very tough to bring down, obviously a huge armour value of 13, as a lot of Dale's high tier units tend to have. So that was Dale. Now we shall move over to the army selection screen, and we'll talk a little bit more about what I think of this somewhat underused faction, I think. I don't think Dale are too popular, and honestly I can see why. I think that when you look at Dale and you think, why would I want to play as Dale as opposed to someone like Gondor or Umbar, who are a little bit more safe. They do a lot of the same things that Dale do, but at the same time they have genuine units. They have units that they can fall back on, which will rarely steer them wrong. So for example, Gondor with their Fountain Guard. Umbar of course have got access to a knight unit in the shape of the Warlords, which can really help secure them in terms of the horseback fight. Dale, really when it comes to units like that, you have their high tier archers here, the Dalian Royal Guard and the Blackshot Dragon Slayers. But of course archers are something which can be shut down by an experienced player, and their fangs can essentially be taken away from them a little bit. And the longer that Dale's archer line is not able to fire in such a situation, then the less likely victory becomes for them. But I do feel like that is a little bit harsh on them in many ways, because they do have genuine options, and in some ways when you start to look at some of the armies that they can field in certain situations, they can become quite a scary proposition to fight. For example, if you have a look at the Earls of Esgaroth and the Barding Herd, the last time that I played as Dale actually, which was quite some time ago now, but then this was pre sort of all the hotfix stuff that's been going on, the combination of the Earls of Esgaroth and the Barding Herd on the front line was fantastic for me, and it was a very, very difficult front line for some of the more traditionally armoured kingdoms of man or the dwarves to take on, because they cover for one another's weaknesses quite well. You've got the Earls of Esgaroth, which can sort of block the enemy arrows, as well as deal with the enemy when they get into close range, and then you've got the Barding Herd, which help keep them at range. But both of these units are relatively expensive at 825 and 750, and the price I paid for this was I had to bring a significantly worse skirmish line. I think I only had 3 units of Laketown Bowmen, 4 units of Laketown Spearmen with 2 on each flank, and then I was bringing some Earls of Dale to sort of protect my back lines. It's all a question of what you want to sacrifice. As Dale, you have to look at what high tier units you want to bring and what focus your army needs to have, because I think more so than some of the other kingdoms of men that you would, stuff like Gondor for example, which is a good faction to compare Dale to in many ways, you can more easily lose the battle in the army selection screen, if that makes sense. If you pick the wrong army for the job, then your weaknesses and shortcomings as Dale will be more ruthlessly exploited than many equivalent factions. However, if you build your army right, then you can also put that ball back into your opponent's court, because you can make it very, very difficult to play against you as Dale, and this is another reason why I think they might not be quite so popular, mainly because a lot of the time, a lot of your strategies will base themselves around making yourself as awkward to play against as possible for your opponent. Dale do tend to do a little bit better when they're on the defense rather than on the attack. It's not to say you can't be offensive, of course, it just requires a different kind of army and perhaps a different kind of opponent. But yes, they're a bit of an enigma, Dale, I will say, but I do think that some of the criticism about them is a little bit unwarranted. I do feel as though they do certainly have some genuine options throughout their roster that can be used to great effect against a great many factions in the game, but it does require a little bit more thinking and a little bit more preparation to pull off with regards to picking the right army for the job, because it's not always enough to simply bring your survivable skirmishers and bring a bunch of polearms on the front line, because people will get wind of that sort of tactic very quickly and then they will counter it, and you won't have any answer to that. So yeah, that is Dale. Very mixed bag of a faction for many people. I quite like them, honestly. Generally speaking, I do like to be a little bit more proactive, but if I have to be defensive, then I actually quite like playing as Dale or Umbar, especially considering that Dale aren't really thought of in the highest regard as it stands, I don't think, based on the fact no one really talks about them ever. But yeah, next up we will be returning back to the Elven/Dwarven factions, and based on the fact that the hotfix is now out, I will be making a return to Imladris. So yeah, I hope you enjoyed this and found it somewhat informative, and I hope you'll join me for that.